So feel free to jump in and ask questions. We're pretty casual around here. And today we're going to be talking about misinformation and how strategic communications can fight that misinformation and how we're seeing more of it on a day-to-day basis. We're seeing it in a big way. In terms, I'll show you some really huge examples, and I'll show you some small examples and how it can affect small businesses and organizations. But we do open all of our presentations with a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth, Alchemy Communications, as an inhabitant of Calgary, Alberta, honors and acknowledges the Mohkinstsis and the traditional Treaty 7 territory and oral practices of the Blackfoot Confederacy. That includes Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, as well as the Ayarhe, Nakota, and Tsuut'ina nations. We acknowledge that the territory we work and live upon is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3 within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. So most of you here know us, but if you don't, Alchemy Communications specializes in marketing and public relations, and then we also do quite a bit of community engagement, public engagement for municipalities, and crisis communications. We, at any given time, half of our business is nonprofit, but we also work with small to mid-sized businesses and corporations and municipalities. So we are hearing lots of different fake news stories along the way on the work that we do. We helped with the bylaw in the municipality of Calgary to ban conversion therapy for the queer community. We had a lot of people saying, that just doesn't happen here. It doesn't happen in Alberta, which is not true. And no matter what we said, that was the narrative that we were hearing from those misinformants. On flood mitigation and climate change, we hear a lot of people saying we're not at risk of climate change. And no matter, I heard that this morning. And as you can see from the news on Hurricane Fiona, we do know that our landscape is changing as a result of extreme weather events. So we know that to be true. So how do we have these people that still stick to these narratives, and why does that happen? Wastewater systems as well. We're seeing tourism areas, lakes that are have communities built on the tourism of the area, really frustrated at changes to the wastewater system. They say, we've had septic fields for 100 years. Why do we need to have a wastewater treatment system now? They say waste does not contaminate lakes and cause algae blooms, but we do know that to be true. And then, of course, COVID, it's just the flu. I don't need to wear a mask. I don't need a vaccine. The vaccine's dangerous. Or even there's a microchip in the vaccine. We've heard all kinds of those things. And when we hear them, sometimes we dismiss them as ridiculous, but it's important that we understand where those are coming from and why people are believing them. So that brings us to the state of media currently. So media is no longer passively consumed. It's created, shared, liked, commented on, attacked, and defended by millions of people. And so this is where we get a lot of struggles, because what could be a press release that typically is shared to 100,000 people is now attacked, especially with certain hashtags that are really effective. They are attacked and shared widely globally. So the algorithm used by the most powerful tech companies are brilliantly designed to personalize and tailor these services to each user's profile. This is something that you really have to understand if you're in the communications field, is that you wonder why, for example, how can someone argue this morning that there's no climate change in Canada? If you look at how they consume their news, you might be consuming tier 1 media. So I live in Calgary, Alberta, so I would see the Calgary Herald. I watch Global TV. I watch the Global News. I watch Global National, sometimes watch CTV National. They are using the stories around climate change really heavily. Now, if you're consuming media through social media, if you're consuming your news through social media is built to give you more of the content that you click on. So if you click on stories around that there is no climate change, that weather events happen, that they've always happened. These are not unusual. It was a bad storm, yes, but it's not unusual. Climate does change over long periods of time. It's not people that have changed that. Then you're going to get more of that content. You're not going to see the same content I'm seeing. So when I hear the CTV national news talking about that, I believe it. When someone else sees something on social media that says climate change doesn't happen, they believe it the same way that I believe the tier 1 media. So you have to think about what media people are consuming. This is a story that's very active currently. This person just lost a very large settlement in a lawsuit. His name's Alex Jones. He owns a company called InfoWars, and he started as kind of a underground basement dwelling person with a radio show around. He originally started with the Branch Davidian tragedy in Waco, Texas, and started criticizing the federal approach to how that was handled. And of course, looking back on it, we see that there was a lot of issues with it. He was quite inflammatory about it. But then it started to go into the Oklahoma City bombing of the federal building, then the 9/11, how 9/11 wasn't a terrorist attack, that it was an inside job. And it escalated to the Sandy Hook tragedy. So the Sandy Hook tragedy was a school shooting, but it was small children, kindergartners that were killed. And he shared a lot of information to suggest that he basically came out and said it didn't happen. At the same time, he was selling a variety of survivalist gear, a line of overpriced and ineffective vitamins and supplements. He testified in September that his sales between 2015 and 2018 were $165 million. So the interesting part about this is the people that we typically deal with on a day-to-day basis truly believe that the news that they've seen on social media that says climate change isn't real or vaccines don't work, they truly believe that. This person built a business. He knew that he was telling lies. He knew he was making a lot of money on those lies. He knew he was influencing a lot of people because it all came out in court. And so he did lose that lawsuit, but he made a lot of people misunderstand. That's very generous, what happened, especially at Sandy Hook. So you can imagine if your child had been killed in that tragedy, and then this person's out there telling everybody, millions and millions of people, that it never actually happened. So Cision is a tool that a lot of communications companies use to monitor media, to share that kind of thing. The State of the Media report in 2022 interviewed 3,800 journalists and asked what they believed the biggest challenge was in 2021. And that was 32% said that was fake news. I believe that's even grown more significantly now. 2018, MIT did a similar study. They found, and we know that this has even grown since, the MIT just hasn't redone the study, but 70% are more likely to retweet false news stories than true news stories. True stories take about 6 times longer to reach the same number of people as false news stories. And it's absolutely about, journalists have a code of conduct. Real journalists have a code of conduct that they commit to, that they're going to tell a story in an unbiased way, that they're going to hear both sides of the story. Hopefully the titling of this story is unbiased in its approach. False news stories are completely different. They do not have that same experience. They're going to be inflammatory. They're going to try and get as many people looking at that story as ever before. So false news stories are more likely to be retweeted by unique users, which also builds the influence of that tweet or that post, as you know, if you monitor social media. Anybody in marketing wants unique users to retweet or repost a story. False news is shared way more likely this way on unique users. And absolutely, we know it spreads more rapidly than real news does by a substantial margin. So this is really frightening if you're looking at any kind of informational, important information to share within a large number of people. So in the case of COVID, I just did a presentation on Monday or last week and Friday in Montreal. And people from the Canadian Medical Association were there, and they were saying, you know, this is so difficult when they're trying to share unbiased information, research. It's at a much higher literacy level. And then they're competing against these false news stories that are way more inflammatory, way more salacious, get much more of those people who are more likely to share those stories, get their eyes on it more quickly. So it's a massive challenge. So the key findings from that MIT study are that researchers were absolutely stunned to discover that false information, it's not due to bots, which we originally thought. We thought it was robots that were doing that retweeting, resharing. People are sharing those inaccurate news items. Researchers from the MIT speculated that it might be due to the fact that the stories are novel. They are more likely to elicit an emotional response. And they shed new light on fundamental aspects of our online communication ecosystem. So if you believe that we're living in a democracy, democracy does not live effectively unless we have really good journalists that commit to that code of conduct of writing unbiased stories. And so as soon as the news is removed from that experience, and you have people voting, for example, or you're trying to connect to people to protect them from a viral disease, then you have a really hard challenge ahead of you. If you can't trust what your news is giving you, then you can't make decisions effectively. And so who has the right news is what people are having to decide. And what is the accurate story? And what are the experiences behind that story as well? Like when we think about rumor mongering, I don't know if anybody here has listened to or watched the TV show 5 Days at Memorial, but it's a really interesting look at how the story is about Memorial Hospital in Louisiana and in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. They were the hospital that was cut off and they weren't able to evacuate patients, and how rumors spread and what that led to was very serious decisions that made a lot of people very nervous. I'm just going to ask everybody to mute their screens because we're getting some feedback there. So it's really important to understand our ecosystem of communication and how it affects all of us. So strategic communications plays a critical role in moving forward. So what do we do when fake news strikes? So we have to stay calm. Our knee-jerk reaction usually makes things worse. And it's not the time to panic. Ideally, you would have been working through communication strategies that would have addressed a fake news issue so that you do have a protocol to follow. That would be my preference for you, is that we all have protocols that address certain issues. So you have a crisis communications plan. So we want to make sure that you can move quickly and effectively. Your board or your CEO is aware of the plan so that you don't have to jump through a number of approvals. It can take minutes for information to go viral. So you need to have a plan ahead of time so you can respond quickly. You need to use your social listening tools, your media monitoring tools. Not everybody has access to these, but there's cheap tools like Google Alerts that work very effectively as well. It's not going to give you the same amount of data, but it's going to give you a lot of data to understand how quickly something is spreading. You also have to be watching who are the influencers on the topic. If you're not paying attention to, say, for example, Instagram stories, social listening tools don't often hear verbal video, and they don't measure it. So if you're not paying attention to that, you might miss it. And then always make sure your online presence is active. So people here will have a up-to-date website. They'll be using their social media, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes we'll get a client that everything is outdated, especially our nonprofit clients. They're already over capacity, underfunded. And then something like this hits and they're having to get caught up very, very quickly. So your narrative needs to be louder than their narrative. And this is a very difficult thing to do, to keep up with. especially if you're an underfunded or overcapacity organization, which I think almost everybody is right now. So you have to have as much content or more, so that you're louder than your competitor, the person pushing that fake news. Now, if you're going up against Alex Jones, who has millions and millions of followers, you're going to have a really hard time. And I'll show you the example of how big those things get. You need to be clear, transparent, truthful, and available through all media channels. So you might not be on LinkedIn, and that might have been a choice that you made a long time ago. But if you're not on those channels and this story happens and you're trying to address it, it's not the time to build a channel. So make sure you're building those channels long in advance. Stick to your values. So we always, as communications professionals, try to lean into uplifting quality content, sharing quality content, truthful content, transparent content. When we look at who we partner with and who we represent, we're looking at what the story says, what their press release is saying versus what their values are, and do they match? We all have a role to play in ensuring that we're not fueling those fake news stories. And then you have to be aware of the Streisand effect. So this is something that we talk about all the time in crisis communications. So a few years ago, Barbara Streisand built this enormous mansion in California on this cliff, and a small news, paparazzi type of publication got a photo of it, and she sued them in order to prevent them from sharing that photo. And what she inadvertently did is she made a story that was probably not going to get much coverage, not have very many people see it. She gave it a lot more legitimacy, and she elevated the story to the fact that it was then on national news, international news, and now communications professionals call it the Streisand effect. So what she was trying to do of suppressing the information and showing her privilege, she actually elevated it. And so you have to be careful. If someone says something completely ridiculous, but they don't have much influence, it might not be worth responding to. That being said, if it does have some truth to it, you don't want to wait until there's public outrage in order to address something. So you have to really decide if it's worth addressing, or if it's worth ignoring. And that's a very difficult thing to do in the moment of emotion. And so these are the things that you want to talk about long before you get there. So what's the protocol? We do a lot of crisis communication scenarios where we say, okay, bring the team into a room. We give them the scenario and we say, okay, minute 1, what do? You've just found this story. What are you going to do next? Minute 15, action B happens. Minute 37, action C happens. And then the team has to respond in real time. And I think that's a really good activity for a lot of communications programs or companies, communications teams to do for the companies they represent, so that they understand how hard it is to get approvals in those timeframes. You can't always get access to the chair of your board. You can't always get quorum. You can't always get, especially if your CEO is in the midst of being called out, they might not be in the right frame of mind to make a good decision on how. And sometimes you can use humor. If a fake news is particularly ridiculous, humor can be a good tactic for deflating it, but you have to be careful. And I'll talk a little bit about that with Bill Gates. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of you remember Bill Gates was working on the vaccine and for COVID and investing in it heavily. So not him himself, but he was investing in it. And a lot of people were talking about how Bill Gates was going to be putting microchips into the vaccine so that they can follow everything we do. And his first response is, this is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard of. I'm trying to protect you from this terrible virus and help people. And you're thinking that I'm doing this for nefarious reasons. And it's kind of a crazy suggestion. But what happened is he got a lot of pushback. There were so many people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, of people actually believed this to be true. So again, you can't expect everybody to be consuming the same kind of news that you're consuming. So he actually had to stop making jokes about this and say, I understand that people are actually believing this, so I'm going to reassure you that there are no microchips in your vaccine. And that is a very difficult thing to do. And if you hear any interviews of him speaking on this, it's very interesting. Like, he's obviously a very methodical person, and to have to put in a communication strategy on something that was so ridiculous was really hard for him. And it would be hard for a lot of us, I can imagine. And now that we're moving out of the pandemic crisis mode, he's able to start to make jokes about it again, but he really had to pull that back in phase 2 of this communication strategy. So I'm going to stop the share for a second because I want to show you what this looks like. Bear with me. My PowerPoint did not like the embedded video here. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So this is Pizzagate, and you might remember this, but you might not. So I'm going to show you the video.
Fake news, real gunfire. A North Carolina man arrested in a DC pizza shop after brandishing a gun, telling police he was there to investigate a conspiracy theory called Pizzagate.
One of the hosts runs up and it's like, did you see that guy? And he had a big gun.
We actually thought initially that he was a staff member because he was walking straight for that back room. Staff member, kind of looked at me and indicated that this was a gunman.
Edgar Welch appearing in court this afternoon. According to police, Welch said that he had read online that the Comet Ping Pong restaurant was harboring child sex slaves and that he wanted to see for himself if they were there. The suspect said he was armed to help rescue them. The accusation came from this unhinged story that originated online days before the election, saying that Hillary Clinton and her campaign chairman, John Podesta, were operating a child sex ring. The lie took root in the digital swamps of Twitter and far right-wing websites.
We're not covering Pizzagate enough, even though we covered it every day to expose the Satanism and the occult and the code words for pedophilia.
October 30th, a Clinton-hating, Trump-loving Twitterer claimed a police source said Clinton was at the center of a pedophilia ring. Others latched onto this, seemingly hoping it was true, scouring dark corners of the web for possible clues. This is how conspiracy theories are threaded together, lie by lie. Eventually, a name stuck, Pizzagate, and the believers started harassing the owner of the pizza place.
We've received many calls, but really they're from around the world. So we didn't expect anyone to come.
On Sunday, the suspect fired his weapon. No one was hurt. With detectives still on the scene in DC, Pizzagate believers were already claiming that this real development was just part of a cover-up.
The media is claiming that this is because of Pizzagate. This is very dangerous fake news. Anybody claiming that the gunman at Comet Pizza had anything to do with Pizzagate is lying.
So let me just stop this so it doesn't start again. So as you can see, even with someone as wealthy as the Hillary Clinton campaign really struggle with fake news. And in fact, they struggle with it even more. So here's a situation where Comet Pizza in Washington, DC, I actually was lucky enough to meet someone who knew this, who lived down the street from Comet Pizza. So Comet Pizza actually does way better at the beginning, business-wise, because they're having so much attention come to them. And for the average person, they see it as a bizarre story. This restaurant doesn't actually even have a basement. It's a very tiny little pizza joint, community, like not a chain, a community member owned, that kind of thing. And so for a long time, they had more business as a result of it. And then they have an active shooter come on site. So here's a situation where the Hillary Clinton campaign did not address it directly. It was too ridiculous to even address. Now, the pizza company leveraged it in order to have more business. And I can see why they would do it. They were making jokes about it, but you can't ever understand how someone's going to, who maybe has a mental illness, might hear that story and act upon it. And so it's something to really consider before you get into that humor strategy. If it's so ridiculous, but you have to think about how someone might interpret it, who might not have the balanced reaction that you would. So if you're in the communication strategy world, I encourage you to think about how you would develop a tactic, or what your tactics would be, what your strategy would be, how would you share your message? What would your message be? What would your 3 key messages be in sharing that information? So if you're a business owner, like if you're the business owner of Comet Pizzeria, you might want to leverage the fact that you're getting all this attention, but you might also want to say, if anybody would like a tour and to see how we don't even actually have a basement, please come in. If anybody would like to see how we make our pizza, please come in for a tour, that kind of thing. I would lean into that more than I would dismiss it with humor, especially on something that's so contentious. And especially when there's so many active shooter scenarios. So we're coming to the end of our time right now, but if you wanted to share your thoughts on this, if you wanted to brainstorm it with me, I'm happy to do that with you. I've got my email address up and I've got my phone number there too. So feel free to if you ever have any questions about this or how we address it here in our office, I'm always happy to go through it. But are there any questions anybody would like to go through right now? I know some of you had to come on a little bit later, and I've recorded the session if you want to go back and see the earlier minutes.
Catherine,
Yes.
has your organization ever had to work with a client where there was fake news or news being peddled?
Yeah, absolutely. On climate change in particular. So the federal government and the provincial governments are investing, especially in flood mitigation in Alberta. And it's interesting to see how many residents do not want berms. And you can understand if you've invested in a home that's on a river and has a beautiful view, you probably don't want a 3-meter high earth berm in your backyard. And especially if you've lived there for, we've had people stand up and say, I've lived here since 1951 and I've never seen a flood that's come up to my house. Why do I need a berm? Well, if you don't follow the news, if you don't see how climate change is creating these massive, severe weather events that we've never seen before, you're not going to believe me when I say, here's the research that says, it's coming. You're going to think that there's maybe you might think that there's a nefarious reason, especially if you don't trust the government. So if you believe that, there's just another opportunity to take money from taxpayers or to line your pockets or that kind of thing, people lean into that narrative quite heavily. And so we know that those municipal projects that need public engagement, we need to be the louder voice in the room when it comes to those fake news stories. And we know we're probably not going to change their minds. It's that bell curve, like 10% of the people on that curve are going to love it and are going to share publicly how they think it's the best thing ever. And there's a wide swath of people that go, of course, climate change is happening. We need flood protection in this area. We can't get mortgages or house insurance without this. So of course, do it. And then there's going to be 10% that are going to lean into these fake news stories. They're going to share them. They're going to believe them. And they're going to aggressively push them. So if you're a publicly funded project like that, sometimes it's hard to fund keeping the communications going so that your voice is louder than theirs. And you're not going to change them. You just have to out talk them. And that takes a lot of energy and a lot of work. Yeah. Thanks, Gail. Are there any other questions I can address right now? Well, I wanted to thank you for coming. Like I said, the presentation has been recorded. So if you weren't able to join us until later, feel free, you'll get a copy of it or a link to the final video. And I've got my information up. So if you have a question about fake news, but you're not able to share it, maybe it's confidential at this point, but would like to talk to me about it, I'm always happy to do that. And thank you so much for attending. I really appreciate having you all here. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Catherine.